Oh, yeah.
Get any attitude off them. They were dead sound in your
Yeah.
and said it isn't. But there's still time, is what she said. If you still want to get one, there's still time.
So I went on the page and it said you haven't got permission.
Yeah. They got one in the end. Right. But they got one in the end because Lynn raised the awareness. Yeah. Kaz raised his initial one, but she didn't raise it online. She raised it to Lynn personally, and then Lynn raised it online, and then everyone jumped all over it and said she was a...
That's right.
Said she
tour now. It was 23 dates around the country, and I was trying to fit them in before the election for reasons that will become apparent. Although obviously I'm not here in any kind of a political capacity. I'm sure you're aware that I have no political allegiance whatsoever, but I mean I will be making some observations about the coming election. That's really not my focus, because what I'm going to show you is that what's unfolding on a wider basis was actually scripted 83 years ago. So when you look at what's happened and you realise that everything that's happened was scripted, and you see where the script goes, it's not rocket science to say, well, you know, actually we can pretty much extrapolate where we are right now and see where we're going. And the next 5 years are going to be absolutely seminal. I mean, more than most people can comprehend. And when I join the pieces of the jigsaw together for you, I mean, you'll see it immediately. I mean, I'm probably not going to give you any brand new information, but just join a few dots for you. So it's more a question of what we're able to develop over the next 5 years. Because I think 2020 is absolutely crucial. Because if we haven't managed to get some kind of common sense, some kind of normality back into British society, then we may well have reached the point, I won't say of no return, but it'd certainly be a lot more difficult to claw it back. So, but obviously I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that was possible. You know, and I am, I won't say an optimist, but I'm encouraged by, you know, what I do see, not just here, but around the world. Because there is a growing awareness. You know, it might not be to the sort of level that we might wish for, but on the other hand, that may be working in our favour as well. You know, somebody said to me at the Glasgow event where we had, you know, a really good, almost full room, and they said, you know, there should be 500 here. And I said, no, absolutely not. Because if we had 500 in every location, it would start to draw too much attention. And what we need to be doing is working below the radar for the time being, and sort of building up this grassroots movement that gets so big, it's into the psyche across the nation before the establishment realise what's going on. And what I'm going to show is that there's a lot of this groundwork already in place. And there's a lot of things happening that the establishment is desperately trying to work out how to deal with. And because it's so different from anything they've ever come across before, then they're struggling with it. And so I'm going to come full circle. We're going to look in the first half of the evening at what's going on a global basis. Then we're going to bring it down to the UK, and obviously then look at what it is that we can be doing to make sure that this agenda doesn't get fulfilled, and that effectively humanity takes back its rightful sovereignty of the planet. But no presentation will be complete right now without me at least touching on the unconventional gas agenda, seeing as that's what I've spent the last 2.5 years really focusing on. I don't think I came to Stockton. I think I was in Durham. I think that was where I did... Yeah, the Fractured Future tour, where I did 63 dates around the country in, well, 5 months, basically 6 months, from March and through until the midpoint of July of 2013. And the reason I did that was because unconventional gas looked like it wasn't even going to get off the ground here, because the only well that had been drilled and fracked was on the Fyle Peninsula, just outside Blackpool. And this was drilled and fracked in almost exactly 4 years ago, actually, because the first seismic event that they triggered was on April the 1st of 2011, and the second one was on May 27th. And the first one was 3.5 on the Richter scale, and the second one was 2.7. So not tsunami-inducing events, but enough to cause damage to an estimated 80 properties. Now the damage was such that You know, it was ceilings coming away from walls, door frames coming away from walls, bathroom and kitchen tiles cracking. Damage that wasn't there before Quadrilla fracked, but was certainly there afterwards. So once it was established that this was most probably the cause, and in fact Quadrilla in August accepted that they were most probably the cause of these seismic events, that's when the moratorium was put on. That's a temporary ban. And I must confess, I thought at the time, thank goodness for that, you know, hopefully this insanity isn't going to come to this country. But I was in Australia in November of 2012, and I was doing a series of talks around the country. And while I was there, I took the opportunity to go into gas fields in southern Queensland. Now, it wasn't as bad as this back then. A lot of this has manifested literally in the last 2 years. But that's an area, that's about 10 miles this way, 9 miles this way. Every one of those triangles, and by the way, this isn't something I've cooked up on Photoshop. This is Google Earth with the Queensland government's own data overlay. So that's the Queensland government's own information. Each one of these triangles represents a well site. Each well site represents an average of about 8 wells. Every time you see a space like this is a landowner that hasn't taken the dirty money and has refused to allow the gas companies to come onto their property. Obviously it's Australia, they're very sizable properties. But nonetheless, what the gas companies do is literally drill all around them. And they literally go right up to the edge of their property, and then they drill under them.
Yeah. Oh, the little sparse ones around the edge, are they like exploratory ones, then up the expanding on?
Yeah, that's right. These are just the exploratory wells, the pads here, this is obviously the main fields. And it's literally spreading out like this. So in southern Queensland now, actually, since 2006, they've drilled over 12,000 wells. Literally in the space of less than 10 years. So I was up there in 2012, bragging that we got a moratorium in the UK. But when I landed, literally, pretty much landed in the first few days of December, and a couple of days later, David Cameron lifted the moratorium on hydraulic fracturing in this country. So that was when I realised that we had a problem, and that was why I cancelled all my plans for 2013, put the 63-day tour together. Knew I had to finish the tour before the middle of July because I knew Quadrilla were planning on going back to Balcombe at some point around about the middle of the year. And obviously I wanted to be sowing the seeds around the country before then. Well, I'm pleased to say that here we are in 2015 and we have still not had any further wells drilled and fracked. And that's primarily due to the massive response of the people that came to Balcombe. There was a 66-day campaign at Balcombe, which slowed Quadrilla down to the extent that they weren't able to complete the project before they ran out of planning permission. So they had to get off the pad by September 28th, and they're still not back there now, but they do have permission to go back there. Then, of course, we went up to Manchester, to Barton Moss, and spent the winter in Barton Moss, and this was the first time that I had entered into any kind of legal conflict with the gas companies because iGas and Peel Holdings tried to evict us from the roadside there. The initial hearing, the judge ruled in favour of iGas and Peel Holdings being the landowner, but the judge did agree that provided we submitted an appeal by 12 noon the following day, then we could appeal. Well, we managed to get the appeal into the Royal Courts in London by 12 noon, and the judge in the appeal courts agreed there was grounds for appeal. So iGas and Peel Holdings were not able to evict us, and the appeal date was set for the July of 2014, but by which time we'd gone, because the project was over. So we managed to manage the situation where we still had the appeal. The judge had awarded costs against us. We could have still gone ahead with the appeal, but we basically negotiated with iGas and Peel Holdings that we would drop the appeal if they dropped the court costs against us, which, incredibly, they agreed to. So got away with that one, but I wasn't quite so fortunate at Crawberry Hill, where Humberside Police made it very clear that they weren't going to let us do any kind of protest there whatsoever. So we built a castle in front of the gates, built a wooden structure, which we expected to only be there for a few days before we were served eviction papers, but we were there for about 3 months. But when we did go to court, we lost that case. So I have right now about £34,000 worth of court costs hanging over me. But don't worry, I'm not going to put the hat around because I basically told Rathlin that they can go whistle. Because one of the things that is an unfortunate situation in a corporatocracy, which is what we live in, is that the corporations know that most people are not likely to challenge them because people are in the bondage of their assets. In other words, you're not going to put everything that you've worked hard to accumulate at risk by challenging the corporations, and they know that. So the only way in which you can challenge them is to have nothing. So of course that's exactly what I've done. I've effectively got rid of everything. Every time I finish a talk, I actually have to go out and make sure my car's still there. Don't put that up on YouTube.
All the bailiffs really upset when they come and you've got nothing to give them.
I know, you see. But then you're the worst nightmare. When you've got nothing, because they can give you some. And so they sent me the letter. Well, they served me the papers. They came to Crawberry Hill to serve me the papers. And they said, I said, yeah, give them to me. I said, that's fine, no problem. Good luck with that. Because I had to respond in 28 days, and I basically responded and I said, look, first of all, I don't accept that I'm responsible for it, but if a court decides otherwise, I want an absolute detailed breakdown. I want to know where every penny was spent. And even if the judge still says that, we owe, because there's 5 of us with the same amount of money, if the judge still says we owe it, then we're going to go to the European courts, because we're going to challenge in the European courts the legality of a corporation initiating a case where no single individual in the corporation stands to lose anything. Because they're ring-fenced by the company logo. But any individual that challenges them, of course, stands to lose everything. So I'm not sure that they really want to take that to Europe, because if we win, then that's a very significant precedent. So they'd probably just rather leave it hanging. But, we still have to be very careful, because here we are in Stockton, and right now, you're not directly impacted. The closest areas to you guys are Third Energy in the Vale of Pickering, Rydale, and then we've got Rathlin Energy down here. This is Dart, which is now owned by iGas. But more concerning, and these are not live yet, but more concerning are these underground coal gasification licenses all the way down the coast here. Underground coal gasification is like fracking's ugly sister. It's outrageous. It's a technological arrogance where these guys believe that by setting the underground coal seams alight, pumping water down, obviously to create steam under pressure, which they then use to drive the turbines to create electricity, but they also milk off the gases from the burning coal seams in the belief that they can control the fires. In reality, they can't. And the only live example of this was set up in Australia a few years ago. It was Link Energy, L-I-N-C, not L-I-N-K, Link Energy. And basically, once they got it started, they realised that they couldn't control it. And they tried to shut it down, and it's still burning. So we don't have any live projects yet. There's no planning applications been submitted for any of these underground coal gasification projects, but we have to watch this like hawks.
Them grey areas, there's oil pipelines, gas pipelines coming through there, and there's a nuclear power station.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I know, it's crazy. It's an absolute absurdity. But despite the fact that there's no licenses directly here, you're not out of the woods. Because everything that's in brown here is already licensed. Everything that's in green was put up for grabs last year. And if you wanted to put in a bid for any of these green areas, you had to submit your tender before October the 28th last year. Now, because of the election, the government has decreed that the adjudication of the tenders will be pushed back until after the election. Now, we don't know exactly which areas of the green were bid for. But what we do know is that a third of them were bid for. So this is the green represents 46% of the country. So a third of 46 is approximately 15. 15% in addition to the 18%, which is already licensed, that's the brown areas. So 15 plus 18, that's 33. So what we're looking at is a situation where by the end of this year, potentially, 33% of this country is licensed for the exploitation of unconventional hydrocarbons, which can only be extracted via the process known as hydraulic fracturing or fracking. So we're definitely not out of the woods. Now we've had a bit of support, if you like, from OPEC, because the price of oil over the last 9 months has dropped from around $100 a barrel in the middle of last year, and now it's oscillating either side of about $50 a barrel. Now the reason it's there is because the neocons are determined to destroy the economies of Iran and Russia, and they think that the fastest way they can do that is by tanking the price of oil, so that they can't obviously get the revenues that they need, the global revenues that they need to sustain their economy. But this is a pretty naive strategy. Meanwhile, the Saudis and the Qataris, Saudi produces oil at a rate that nobody else can match, and at a cost that nobody else can match. I mean, the average cost of a barrel of oil from Saudi Arabia is less than $5 a barrel. And so they're milking it, you know, whatever the price. And of course, when it was 100, I mean, it was like, now it's down to 50, you know, they're still making an enormous amount of money. And because we're now in about the last 40 to 50 years of a hydrocarbon-driven economy, the Saudis and the Qataris obviously want to maximise as much of the market share that they can get over that period. So they're quite happy to play ball with the neocons and drop the price, because what it means is they're gaining market share. So everywhere else in the world right now, the unconventional gas industry is being put into mothballs, because at this price it's just not viable. So they've stopped drilling and they've stopped fracking. I mean, obviously if they've got wells that are producing, then you know there's no investment needed to keep taking it out of the ground. So yeah, they're taking it out of the ground and selling it, and they'll sell it for whatever price they could get. But they're not drilling and they're not fracking, because if they do that, then it's going to push their costs up to $75 a barrel. So why on earth would you exploit something that's costing you $75 a barrel to exploit when you can only sell it for 50 something? It makes no sense. So what's happening everywhere else around the world, the rigs are being put into hibernation, and obviously everyone there is hoping that the price will go back up, which it may not. A lot of commentators now believe that it's going to be at least another 10 years before the price of oil actually gets back up to anything like this level. So with all this going on around the rest of the world, why is it that Cameron and Osborne are still pushing ahead for this industry to get underway in the UK? And why is it that the companies are bidding for these licenses when there's no viability? You know, basically they should all be backing out, saying, you know what, actually we don't want that license anymore. Because the license, if they get the license, it actually requires them to drill exploratory wells. They can't just buy a license and sit on it.
What was the circumstance that allowed the oil to go that high in the first place, which allowed fracking to become viable? What was that?
Well, that was being manipulated upwards, obviously. I mean, you know, because the
Just
US...
because they could.
Yeah, back then the US wanted to become self-sufficient,
Okay.
right? And it would have been. But because they've drilled and fracked close on 1 million wells in the last 20 years in the US. And they're still producing, because they've got the wells drilled and fracked. I mean, they just milk them until they stop producing. And then this is in the document too, and what this is showing is all the areas that are classified as temporary nuclear waste storage areas, and basically what's happened is they haven't moved it. So most of these locations are either military establishments, obviously this is naval bases at Portsmouth and Plymouth, research areas at Aldermaston. I'm not sure why they've got nuclear waste at Cardiff. Obviously on the Clyde here, the submarine, Doudray, and the rest is all basically nuclear power stations around the coast. So that's where the nuclear waste is stored temporarily, pending a more permanent solution, i.e. deep geological disposal. So consider the possibility that this industry, the unconventional gas industry, knew about this, and it already had as part of its game plan, get the licenses, drill the wells initially into the conventional hydrocarbons and extract the conventional hydrocarbons, which are in geology above the unconventionals, then go into the unconventional geology to extract, through fracking, the unconventional hydrocarbons, and then when that's exhausted, you've got a ready-made repository for toxic nuclear waste. Now, as we're flagging this up now, MPs are being asked to respond. And of course you're getting the usual BS. Well, can anybody here tell me what happened in the immediate aftermath of the budget in Parliament on March 25th, I think it was? No? No? Don't beat yourself up, because out of all the talk so far, only one person was aware of this. You're not meant to be aware of it. The whole idea of doing what I'm going to tell you happened immediately after the budget was that the media didn't pick up on it, because the media was obviously focused on the budget and how much tax was going on beer and cider or whatever and cigarettes, and not looking at, it's the magician's trick, you know, keep your eye on the budget when the real issue is the one that's going to happen right now. So after the budget there was a vote in Parliament. The vote was 217 in favour to 33 against, and what our MPs voted on at that day was the change, the amendment in the Infrastructure Act to establish the disposal of toxic nuclear waste as a significant national infrastructure project, a SNIP, a significant national infrastructure project. And what they voted on was removing all participation of local authorities as to where toxic nuclear waste would be disposed. So that should be a significant clue that our elected representatives are not exactly looking after our best interests. 217 to 33. Most of them probably had no clue what the hell they were voting on. They were simply responding to the division bell. So we've got two issues to keep working on here. One is we've got to continue to raise awareness of the magnitude of the devastation that's caused by the unconventional gas industry in of itself, and then raise awareness of this agenda to turn the UK into a toxic nuclear waste dump, as spelt out by the British government in a white paper last July. Now, I do mention this in the documentary that I've just released called Voices from the Gas Fields, and I'm just going to show you the trailer for this, this new documentary.
Shale gas is part of the future and we will make it happen.
I'm charged with without lawful authority or excuse obstructing the highway. Well, I believe I have lawful excuse.
We're going to take very great care that there is no damage to the water supply.
iGas at Barton Moss contaminated the well site. Then Rathmin Energy were responsible for considerable property damage as a result of their seismic testing.
There is a fishing lake which started to go down immediately following the detonation of these charges.
I think there's a huge amount of myths that are being put round in order to frighten people.
The first person that signed a well was the person that doomed us to this.
A conventional gas well isn't a pipe out of the ground.
dams, water holding ponds.
We're right in the middle of the Australian bush here. Well, it was once bush.
We take this trip literally 520 kilometres for this one company. We sit on the Great Artesian Basin, one of the greatest water resources in the world, and they are allowed to deplete it and turn it to trash.
Green lawn with roses in it. 3 nights of rain, it was dead. Each time it rains, it just comes out black.
You're genuinely so scared of what is happening. It's untrustworthy and it's running out.
This is called the High Point Vent. That'll have everything in it.
The benzene, the toluene, the ethylbenzenes, everything.
When your nose is burning, your eyes are burning, and you got that terrible oily sort of taste, I said, you know, the flares are not, they're just venting. Then other times, it's like little fibres in your throat, you know, the flare is on.
The majority of people that have visited us, they say, how can you live there? You know.
So that's a trailer. And as Brian says in the film, if you don't listen to our story, it'll soon be your story.
dreamt about how things were. And then I woke up here.
That was a film that was being produced by a young American film director by the name of David Crowley. Now, David Crowley had absolutely no history of any kind of mental illness and no history of depression. Yet, in the third week of January this year, he allegedly murdered his family and then committed suicide. 4 days after this, the rough cuts of the film were put up on YouTube. The rough cuts are simply all the interviews that he was doing to get the information from people to be able to get the script for the movie. So like my rough cuts from the documentary are the interviews that I did in Australia. So those rough cuts, they go up and down on YouTube. Somebody puts them up, they get taken down, they go back up. Fortunately, a lot of people have got them on their PCs now. Call it a hunch. I think David Crowley was probably a little bit closer to the truth than the establishment wanted. My good friend Patrick Henningsen spoke at AV5 last year, and immediately after AV5 he went over to the US to cover the unfolding events at the Bundy Ranch in Arizona, which was a state land grab. Or possibly it was an attempt by the US federal government to gauge the strength and the reaction times of the private militia. And a lot of private militia came to Arizona to support the Bundy family. And Patrick was only intending to stay in the US for a few weeks, but he's been there for a year, and he's actually coming back. He's literally flying in on the Thursday before AV6 to share his insights as to what's unfolded in the US over the past year. Patrick is of the opinion that if it was not for the appearance of the private militia at the Bundy Ranch, the US right now would be under martial law.
Yeah.
So he's convinced that the federal government knows very well that if it pushes too hard, it could actually trigger a second American Revolution. And the title of Patrick's talk at AV6 is How the West Was Won Again. And so the US obviously is a very different situation because, you know, the settlers there absolutely protect the Second Amendment, you know, the right to bear arms, because obviously having won their independence from the British, now obviously what they want is they always wanted to protect against tyranny. And the recognition that basically the need to bear arms may well be against those who actually try and take the country, not necessarily a foreign force, but somebody or a cabal who tries to establish their dominion. We in this country don't have that. You know, we are not armed. You know, I must be missing the eBay or Amazon page that ISIS use, because they've got some pretty nice kit, and I know there's quite a few people in this country who'd like to get their hands on some of that. But, you know, we don't seem to be able to find the right Amazon or eBay page, and, you know, all those nice Toyota trucks that those guys drive around in, and all the Nike and Adidas clothing. Well, yeah, we can speculate as to where that's coming from. But we don't have the hardware, and we're not likely to have access to hardware, neither would we want it. So we are going to have to be a lot more creative in the way in which we challenge the establishment. But whereas just as David Crowley was trying to raise awareness of what the agenda is in the US, the totalitarian control, there are others that have done that over the years. Anybody here not read 1984? It is the most widely read novel of the late 20th century. And when George Orwell, Eric Blair, when he wrote this, I doubt he ever expected it to be as widely read as it was. And of course, he was a political commentator. I mean, the two books that he's famed for, Animal Farm, which was an attempt to educate the masses on the risks of left-wing totalitarianism, and 1984, which he wrote in 1948, which is how he got the title, he just transposed the year, was an attempt to warn the wider population about the dangers of a right-wing totalitarian agenda. And both of them were based on reading the scripts. So Animal Farm was based on reading the works of Marx and Engels. 1984 was based on a document that was published in 1932, which I'll introduce you to in a second. In the first black and white movie that was made of 1984, this whole thing, obviously, Big Brother is watching you, the front page of the Daily Mail on Monday, March the 9th of this year was CCTV in every home. A proposition being put forward by the Metropolitan Police as a means of controlling crime. Do you remember, if you can cast your mind to the trailer that you've just seen, there was a scene there where the families were turned around looking up at the CCTV, and then it panned back to the operator monitoring the families sitting in their living rooms. Well, ultimately, as I'm going to share with you, it's not about having a human operator monitor, because what is being developed and is actually being tested right now in Cardiff is software that uses the CCTV footage to monitor body language. Because believe it or not, we are actually creatures of habit. And there are algorithms, computer algorithms, that analyse our body movements, so it knows what our normal body movements are, and if it detects body movements that are a little unusual, it can determine pre-crime, i.e. that some kind of violence may manifest out of this. So ultimately it's looking at the software being the decision maker, the silicon being the decision maker, not a human operator. George Orwell was not a well man. 6 months after 1984 was published, he was dead. But no suspicious circumstances here. It's very well documented that he suffered from a particularly virulent form of tuberculosis, and one might argue actually that he was kept alive longer than he might have otherwise been, because he was a very well-respected journalist and author, and he had some very influential friends who were obtaining the best medicines available at the time. And this was almost like his final work before, unfortunately, he died at 47. The document that he read, that I believe led him to write 1984, was a document written by these two guys in 1932. This was the senior of the two, Howard Scott, and this was his protege, Marion King Hubbard. This guy went on to be one of the founding members of the Club of Rome. And they wrote a document in 1932 called Technocracy Inc. Technocracy Inc. Now, you can find this. It's getting more and more difficult to find it, but it is available on a PDF on the web. But now, whereas once upon a time when you punched in Technocracy Inc., it used to be like the #1 search. Now you've got to trawl through pages and pages to find it. Yeah. As they try and hide the stuff that they know people are starting to become aware of. I'm not going to take you through the whole document, but I'm going to share the synopses with you from page 232 in the document. And the important thing to remember is that this was written in 1932. Because what they didn't have in 1932 was the technology, but what they had was the vision. The technology is now pretty much here. Register on a continuous 24-hour per day basis the total net conversion of energy. So their absolute obsession was on the production and use of energy, and having a balance so that no more energy was produced than was needed, which on a superficial level you say, well, that doesn't sound too bad. By means of the registration of energy converted and consumed, make possible a balanced load. Well, still doesn't sound too bad. But it's how you measure the consumption that really starts to be a cause for concern. Provide a continuous inventory of all production and consumption. A continuous inventory, not a broad brush, a continuous up to the second inventory. Provide a specific registration of the type, kind, etc. of all goods and services where produced and where used. Right down to the individual level. Anybody here buy clothes from Marks and Spencer's? No? Oh, I do. But never with a credit or debit card. Marks and Spencer's have active RFID chips embedded in every item of clothing. For stock control. Purely for stock control. But when you go to the checkout, if you use a credit or debit card, the unique IP address that's associated with that item of clothing is then linked to your credit or debit card. So I'm not suggesting that this is in force yet, but with the technology is there, and we're heading in this direction, where you've got active RFID transmitter receivers all the way down the roads, and the network then picks up, well, here comes Ian Crane wearing a jacket that he bought in the Beverley branch of Marks and Spencer's on such a day. And you say, well, why would anyone want that information? No person wants that information. It's going into the artificial intelligence. And it's building up this database on every single microscopic transaction. Smart meters take it down to another level, because the whole objective of smart meters is literally this. It's to provide a specific registration of the type, kind, etc. of all goods and services, where produced and where used. So smart white goods are now being produced. So every time you open your fridge door, it registers on the smart meter, because obviously the consumption of the fridge changes because the light goes on. And the cold air rushes out, so the condenser kicks in, so it's using more energy. Well, the next stage of this is that you take the milk out, it will register that you've taken the milk out, and it will register how much milk you've used in each transaction. Down to every minute transaction that we make. Provide a specific registration of the consumption of each individual, plus a record and description of the individual. And the whole ethos of the technocrats is that nobody should take out more than they put in.
Well, Lynn knows someone who, not personally, but is aware of someone because of a job, who was grassed up by Tesco's for using their club card, and they'd spent too much money on the club card and they'd registered as self-employed and they ended up getting community service. Just through a Tesco's club card.
So that's fraud on a loyalty card. Yeah, absolutely. Now, because everything is tracked. I mean, if you have loyalty cards, cut them up. You know?
I don't have one.
Well, because every time you use it, that's going into the database. Every time you use a credit or debit card, of course, it goes into the database. So, you know, the bottom line is that's why they're desperate to get to the cashless society. You know, so that they can then go to the next step, which is having the, you know, everything done by your phone, and then ultimately the chip, of course. But so that's why it's so important to encourage people to use cash as much as possible to reduce the amount of tracking that the network can pick up. It's very clear, very, very clear that, you know, nothing is random here. You know, everything that's being introduced is part of the bigger picture, the technocratic agenda. Well, that was 1932. Roll the clock forward, there was another document that came into the public domain in 1967, which was called the Report from Iron Mountain. Now, some people try and dismiss that as a forgery, whatever that might mean. Allegedly, the document came into the public domain because one of the participants had an attack of conscience and wanted the discussions that took place to be put out into the public domain. Now, I don't know for sure whether this guy participated in the Report from Iron Mountain think tank, but either he did, and once the information was put out there, he decided that he was going to use it, or if he didn't, he thought, well, this is bloody good. I'll pick up it. This is Zbigniew Brzezinski. This is Zbigniew Brzezinski. And this is the guy who, having decided that now the information from Report from Iron Mountain was out there, he was going to take that and the information and proposition from Technocracy Inc., and he wrote this book, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. He wrote this in 1969, it was published in 1970, and this is the book that got him to the attention of the Rockefellers, and he's been on the Rockefeller payroll basically ever since. Well, I'm just going to share with you 3 extracts from this book. And, you know, the extracts pretty much sort of give the impression of the mentality behind this kind of philosophy. It says, in the technotronic society, the trend seems to be toward aggregating the individual support of millions of unorganized citizens who are easily within the reach of magnetic and attractive personalities, and effectively exploiting the latest communication techniques to manipulate emotions and control reason. Well, obviously on the face value of that, that's the media. But then it's the careful selection of people, the puppets, that you appoint into positions of power. This document, this book, were so impressed the Rockefellers They put him on the payroll, and it was Brzezinski who introduced Jimmy Carter to the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers then funded Jimmy Carter into office. So he was the charismatic personality that they thought was going to carry out their bidding. Carter proved to actually be a little bit more independently minded, which is why he only had one term and was bounced out. No matter how deeply disturbing the thought of using the environment to manipulate behaviour for national advantages to some, the technology permitting such use will very probably develop within the next few decades. Well, where do we start? Let's start with fluoride in the water. And Ireland, of course, has been fluoridated for 60 years now, and the initial fluoridation was implemented at the recommendation of the American military. You know, a clear attempt to effectively destroy the Celtic passion of the Irish people. Now they're talking about putting lithium in the water in Ireland. And of course lithium is a core ingredient of antidepressants, SSRIs. And for those of you who read 1984, you remember the Soma? Yeah. Soma was the drug that was pumped out to the masses to keep the masses under control, turn them into sort of Stepford wives. Well, now, of course, it goes beyond that because we've got the vaccinations, we've got the Wi-Fi, we've got the, the mobile phone signals, we've got the junk food,
chemtrails.
The geoengineering. It's a multi-pronged attack. And of course, the reason that it's multi-pronged is because different people respond to different things, and the real target isn't so much the adult population, it's the kids. Because just like hypnosis, hypnotherapists or stage hypnotists don't like working with people over the age of 40 because it's a lot more difficult to hypnotise somebody over the age of, not impossible, but more difficult because they're much more comfortable, if you like, in their skin. And they've built up any immunity that they've got. I mean, they're either susceptible or they're not, but they're more likely to be immune. The developing physical vehicle is much more sensitive. And as we'll see later, there's a very clear agenda to work with the youth to effectively make sure that by the time they get to young adulthood, they are completely dumbed down and just ready to get on the treadmill. It involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled and directed society. Such a society would be dominated by an elite whose claim to political power would rest on allegedly superior scientific know-how. Now this next sentence, listen to this very carefully. Unhindered by the restraints of traditional liberal values. Unhindered by the restraints of traditional liberal values. That is Brzezinski speak for we do whatever it takes. Regardless of the collateral, we do whatever it takes to make sure that our political elite has total control and it can't be threatened. This elite would not hesitate to achieve its political ends by using the latest modern techniques for influencing public behaviour and keeping society under close surveillance and control. That's 1969, published in 1970. This book effectively has become the manual for the technocratic agenda. Brzezinski founded the Trilateral Commission in 1973. The Trilateral Commission is the front of house marketing for the technocratic agenda. So everything that we see happening here is also happening in New Zealand, in Australia, in Canada, in the US, certainly across the English-speaking world. We've actually seen situations where John Key's the Premier of New Zealand, Tony Abbott in Australia, John Harper in Canada, and Cameron have given speeches within days of each other, and they're identical. They're identical. So stuff is coming down from the global corporatists, and then the puppets in the leadership roles are simply regurgitating the scripts that are being given to them.
Do you think they know that they're being manipulated like that?
No.
Or is it just fed to them through mind control?
Yeah, I don't think they don't have the time, even if they have inclination, to be following up on this. And if somebody drew their attention to it, they would simply say, "Oh, that's just pure coincidence." Yeah. The most powerful person in this country is Sir Jeremy Hayward, head of the civil service. I mean, he is the guy who continuously refuses to release the correspondence between Blair and Bush in the run-up to the Iraq War, which is why the Chilcot inquiry is pushed back again to like 2017. I mean, they will literally just keep kicking the can down the road. Yeah. You know, and it's Hayward who has obviously been instructed, you know, not to release it. Not only is it a myth, but we are fast descending into a Katie Hopkins type world where unless you are contributing directly to the corporate agenda, you're a parasite. And you should just be left to die, basically. Take a look at this.
People are talking a lot about inequality these days, about the fact that the richest 1% have so much more than everybody else. But most of the focus seems to be on the United States. And it strikes me that the same story needs to be told about global inequality too. So I did some research, and this is what I found from reliable sources like the UN. It turns out that while the US is totally out of whack, things are actually way worse for the planet as a whole. Let's start with this graph. A perfectly even distribution of wealth among all living people, with everyone divided into 5 equal groups. Now, let's show how much each group actually has. Shocking, right? 80% of the world's people barely have any wealth. It's hard to even see them on the chart. Meanwhile, the richest 2%, they have more wealth than half of the rest of the world. Let's look at this chart another way. Let's take the whole world's population, all 7 billion of us, and reduce it to just a representative 100 individuals. Here they are. Poorest people on the left, richest people on the right. Now let's show how the world's total wealth, roughly $223 trillion, is distributed. The vast majority have practically nothing. Nothing with which to educate their children, nothing with which to pay for basic medicines. While the richest 1%, they've accumulated 43% of our world's wealth. The bottom 80%, meanwhile, and that's 8 out of every 10 people, have just 6% between them. But even this doesn't really show how extreme things have become. The richest 300 people on Earth have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion. So the number of people it takes to fill a mid-sized commercial aircraft have more wealth than the populations of India, China, the US, and Brazil combined. We can also see this difference geographically, with a huge and growing gap between a few rich places versus the majority of the world. For most of history, things were much more equal. 200 years ago, rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the end of colonialism in the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. Today, they're about 80 times richer. Rich countries try to compensate for this by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. That's a lot of money. So then why does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? One reason I found is that large corporations are taking more than $900 billion out of poor countries each year through a form of tax avoidance called trade mispricing. On top of this, each year poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries on loans that have already been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries to get access to more resources and cheaper labor. Economists from the University of Massachusetts calculate that this costs poor countries about $500 billion a year. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion that flows from some of the poorest parts of the world to the richest. Every year. Rich governments like to say they're helping poor countries develop. But who's developing who here? This makes me think that there's something wrong with the basic rules of the global economy. It can't be okay that the wealth of our planet is becoming so concentrated in the hands of such a tiny number of people. The only reasonable response, it seems to me, and our only hope, is to change the rules.
So, has everybody here played Monopoly?
Yes.
Yeah? Has anybody ever finished a game of Monopoly?
No.
No. Okay, you finished the game? Yeah? Did you win?
Sometimes.
So, when you win, are you the banker?
No, not always. Like, my brother's always the banker, and he always won. Yeah, so
you mean that you're playing with an honest banker? Well, look, what's going on right now is really just like a game of Monopoly. And, Monopoly goes through certain rounds. And, in theory, everybody starts with the same seed capital, in theory. Of course, one player does have an advantage because they manage the bank. And it's not unknown for the person that is managing the bank to help themselves to an extra couple of hundred when they go past go. Just to give themselves that little advantage, just like real life, really. But you've got to buy up all these properties with your seed capital. And then, because you can't start building on them until you've got a complete set, there's a bit of negotiation or bartering that goes on. But once you've got a complete set in any of these areas, then you can start building your properties. And once you start building your houses and your hotels on the Monopoly board, that's when the real game starts. And what's the purpose of the game from this point forward?
To collect rent.
Make everyone else bankrupt.
Exactly. The game has one conclusion. The only conclusion that is permitted in the game, if you play it to the bitter end, is the economic annihilation of your opponents. It's last man standing. So most people who play Monopoly, who haven't ever finished a game, because after 3 days after Christmas they get bored. And so you eventually reach a point where you say, well, okay, let's just add up who's got what, and whoever's got the most is the winner. But that's not the purpose of the game. The game is total ownership. And that's exactly what is occurring right now. And that artwork that I showed you from Brick Lane, that's the finished product. And what we've got here, of course, is the Great Seal, the capstone which represents the domain of the few. Dr. John Coleman wrote a book in 1986 called The Committee of 300. Which he republished in 2006 after 8 years of use of the internet, where he corrected a lot of his assumptions from 1986 when, of course, he was researching the hard way. Isn't it interesting that the observation was made in that animation that the 300 wealthiest people have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion? Well, 300. Well, that's what John Coleman identified as 300 families who effectively consider themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom. But Coleman even went further. He said within the inner sanctum, or so within that 300, there is an inner sanctum of 13 families. And he made a stab at who those 13 families might be. And of course, it's the usual suspects, the Saxe-Coburg-Goethers, Her Madge, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Schieffs, the DuPonts, etc. Alternatively, it could well be none of them. It could well be names that we just don't know, because I would argue that there's a distinct possibility that the names that we know are, if you like, the front of house, and the real players, the real manipulators, the puppeteers, are people who we don't know. So Dr. John Coleman was one of the academics that made a stab at it. Another one was Carroll Quigley, who was Bill Clinton's mentor. Carroll Quigley actually thought that the whole idea of having a one-world government was a good idea. He just didn't like the way they were going about it. John Coleman wasn't quite so benevolent. But what this depicts, of course, is the banksters, who may or may not be part of the inner sanctum. They may simply be the bankers representing those who live in this, or reside in this domain. But they are playing their game of Monopoly on the backs of humanity. Telling us, showing us, exactly what we are. We're a commodity. A commodity. We are an underclass to them, and now what is being created as this game of Monopoly unfolds is that humanity itself is effectively being rapidly divided between those who have, because they're whoring themselves to the corporatists, and those who do not. And that's where the austerity kicks in. And so, the apprentice mentality, and of course Katie Hopkins was a participant in The Apprentice, And I think last year I did an episode of Humanity vs Insanity with Thomas Sheridan, where we were discussing this meme, this creation of this mindset of how to be a complete bastard. And that's what we're educating our youth, is the way to behave. You know, that the only way in which you survive is to tread on everybody, including friends and family, as you fight to get as far up the greasy pole as you possibly can. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to take a break there, and then in the second half we're going to take that and look at how that's impacting on the UK. Most of which you'll be aware of, but some of which I'm sure you won't, unless this has got right up close and personal. But some of the areas where I was doing some research last year, particularly to the north of Manchester, around the Rochdale, the Bolton, the Burnley, the Accrington area, and some of the things I'm going to share with you from those areas are truly shocking. And if we think we live in a fair society, then we better be waking up fast. But just before we take the break, I'm going to ask a question, and we'll answer it or we'll discuss it when we come back. How many people here are thinking of not voting on May the 7th? Okay, that's about the same sort of percentage as we're seeing at all the events, except in Scotland, where everybody's going to vote. Because they're in a state of euphoria right now, which actually is also a problem of another type, because they're heading into a one-party state. And there's some stuff going on in Scotland which is some deeply concerning when you scratch beneath the surface. So we'll touch a little bit on that, but obviously we're going to focus much more on what's occurring here in England, and we'll start by revisiting that question of who is or isn't voting. Okay, so should we take 10 minutes? Yeah. Stretch your legs, grab a drink, whatever.
One farming family, all 3 million.
Yeah, that's the Parr family in Texas.
Yeah. Is there any others going through? Yeah,
the problem is that the industry will literally do whatever it can to try and avoid the publicity. And it's like I said, we've even got the gagging orders in East Yorkshire now, where these people who had their properties damaged, they're being offered compensation for the property damage, but with the compensation comes the requirement to sign a confidentiality and a non-disclosure agreement that they will never claim that the damage was caused by Rathlin Energy, and they won't let it be known that they were compensated by Rathlin Energy. That's how they try and shut it up. Yeah?
Isn't it despicable, though, that they can get those orders in this country, 2050?
Yes.
Robert Green, for example, shut up for life.
For life, yeah. Not only that, but a global gagging order.
Yeah.
But again, that's what I was saying about Scotland. Scotland has to be careful. I mean, I understand the euphoria, and it's great that obviously the Scots have gelled in this way. But one of the things, this is one of the things I was discussing in Glasgow and Edinburgh. One of the things that you cannot ignore is the power of Scottish Rite Freemasonry north of the border. And so you've seen these posters with Nicola Sturgeon with Ed Miliband in her pocket. Yeah. Well, the real one would be Nicola Sturgeon in the pockets of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. I mean, you've only got to look at the power of Scottish Rite Freemasonry through the legal system in the aftermath of Dunblane. The 100-year gagging order on all the documentation surrounding Dunblane.
That's right.
Because Thomas Hamilton was the patsy,
he was linked to paedophiles,
of course, and to Lord Robertson.
Yeah. But then look at the Hollywood situation in Aberdeen.
Yeah.
How they get away with it, I don't know.
And the danger is that in the coming elections, Scotland could effectively be a one-party state. And then obviously in 2016 you've got the Scottish Parliament.
It's going to be Labour SNP, though, isn't it?
It's got to be.
It's going to be.
It's looking that way.
I mean, that would be the only option open, really. If Miliband
wants to get into
power.
Yeah. Well, he's not. He's lost every seat in Scotland, I think. Miliband, the whole Labour Party behaviour in the run-up to the referendum last September was atrocious.
You see, I can remember back to Dennis Healey, as far back as him. And obviously we all remember Tony Blair and Brown. Or should I say the mess they made with Colin Last? And the time before.
Yeah,
He was actually bankrupt.
yeah.
Got it here, but I didn't know.
Okay.
You're back.
I do apologise, I've got to give you coinage.
Oh, that's all right.
There you go. Thank you very much.
It all goes the same way eventually. Thanks.
Do you know after the Second World War, they used the promise of never being rationed again to implement modern farming techniques in this country? Was that the first stage of this, do you think, or was that just a coincidence that they managed to get?
It may well be. I mean, you know, you can actually trace the Codex Alimentarius agenda back into the late 19th century to get the US dollar off the gold reserve, which happened on August 15th, 1971. And then with the 1973 Middle East War, James A. Baker III and Henry Kissinger basically went to OPEC and said, right, here's the deal, guys. We want to create the impression there's a world shortage of oil. So we want you to cut production. And we want you to be painted as the bad guys in the Western media. But what we're going to give you is 4 times the price that you're getting right now. And they went, where's the catch? And the catch was, they had to accept payment in US dollars from everybody around the world. So this was the means by which they introduced the US dollar as the global reserve currency in 1973. And do you know what they did? So in this country, they issued ration books to every registered vehicle owner. This was, in fact, sorry, 74, the coupons were sent out. So 74 the coupons were sent out because they were never used. It was a pure psyop to create the impression that there was a shortage. And the price of oil, of course, sort of shot up 4-fold. But there was no shortage.
Red rations and all of that stuff.
No. This is blackouts as well, exactly.
We had sugar rations.
Was that the 3-day week?
Yeah, we had the 3-day week. The thing is that we had the first of the miners' strikes as well at the same time.
I'm sure everybody was only allowed 1 bag of sugar a week.
Was it? Okay. I don't remember that. But then the other part of this was that the Saudis refused to cut production, and so the tankers were literally being held offshore. And they, because the British government was saying, no, we don't want them docking. We've got to create the shortage. So all the tankers were being held offshore.
The shortage was an illusion?
A total illusion. It was a total charade. I mean, these guys will do, like I said, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. So let's have a look at the UK now. Because this is the disturbing factor, because obviously Cameron is pumping out the bullshit that, this country's got more people in work than ever before. This country's in, the better economic condition than it's ever been in before. Well, I'm going to put that to bed once and for all. First of all, they say they've got the debt under control, the borrowing under control. Well, of course, it depends how you define control. Because when they came into office, the national debt was 82% of GDP. Now it's 91%. And bear in mind, when it reaches 100%, that's when basically you're bankrupt. Effectively, your creditors own you. So in 5 years, they've taken it from 82 to 91%. Another 9%, and we're at that 100% marker. So we're going to look at a similar sort of animation to that which I showed you about global wealth distribution. And this is looking at UK wealth distribution, which pretty much mirrors what you saw on the global basis. And then, of course, one of the most significant drivers, not the only driver, but one of the most significant drivers to the wealth distribution in the UK is earnings distribution. And I'm going to show you the real situation on earnings distribution, which very, very few people have any comprehension of. As you'll see in the animation, when 2,000 people asked how they thought the wealth was distributed, for the wealth at the bottom end of society, they got it wrong by a factor of 15. They overestimated by a factor of 15 how much wealth the bottom segment of society had. So
in Britain, we take pride from living in a fair country.
We believe that everyone should be given a chance in life to prosper through skill and hard work, whether as a care worker, shop assistant, soldier, civil servant or company boss. However, is Britain as fair as it seems to be? How is wealth distributed in Britain today? Imagine the total wealth of the UK is £100. Now, imagine these people represent the population of the country. A new ICM poll asked 2,000 British people how this wealth should be distributed, from those with less wealth to those with more. As you can see, we think it's right that some people have more wealth than others. In a really fair Britain, we say, the richest fifth would have 25 of these coins. That's 25% of all wealth, while the poorest fifth would have around 15. Even in our ideal world, some people will always have more than others, but we know we don't live in an ideal world. So next, the poll asked what we think is the actual distribution of wealth. As you can see, the results are quite different. We think that in Britain, the poorest fifth now has about 9% of the wealth, while the richest has more than 40%. That's £40 out of every 100. Doesn't seem very fair, until you see what the real situation is. Not what we think it is, or how we think it should be, but how it really is. We can now see that Britain is not such a fair country after all. The fact is that the richest 20% have 60% of all the wealth. That's almost twice as much as everyone else put together, and 100 times more than the bottom 20% have. And the richest 1%? Well, they're off the scale. In fact, they have as much wealth as 60% of the population of the UK combined. As for the poorest fifth, if £100 were the total wealth, they would not even have a whole pound. Next to the richest fifth's £60, they would only have 60 pence. That's small change. This is the result of over 30 years of growing inequality. If this trend continues, it will be even harder to call Britain a fair country. Learn more at www.inequalitybriefing.org.
Okay, so that's the wealth distribution. And it's really got out of control literally over the last 30 years, as has the earnings distribution. So let's have a look at earnings now.
Everywhere, people are paid differently for their work. What we are paid rewards skill, training and experience, as well as the types of work we do. But how big should those differences be between those at the top and the rest of us? And are very large pay gaps good for society and our economy? Let's focus on two people. Brenda is an experienced nurse in one of Britain's busiest hospitals. After several years moving up her pay scale, she earns £12 an hour, the average wage in the UK. Brian is the boss of one of Britain's biggest companies. He earns £1,200 an hour. That's 100 times more than Brenda earns. In fact, that means Brian makes as much in just 3 days as Brenda earns in a whole year. Brenda struggles to get by on what she gets paid. Wages for average earners like Brenda have hardly changed in a decade, whilst food prices are going up, gas and electricity bills are rising, and rents are going through the roof. Brian, on the other hand, has seen his annual pay increase by £2 million over the same decade. That means he now earns 4 times as much in 1 year as Brenda will in her entire life. Doesn't seem very fair, doesn't it? The fact is, for the first time, most people in poverty in the UK are actually in work. Growing numbers of working people struggle to pay the bills, and now resort to food banks just to survive. And as people on average incomes are increasingly squeezed, less money is spent in our high streets. The growing pay gap between pay at the top and pay for everyone else is bad for those who earn the least, bad for average workers like Brenda, and bad for Britain's economy. And all the while, people like Brian do better and better. But it doesn't have to be modern, successful European countries have prosperous societies with all the new technology and consumer goods that we enjoy in the UK. But in those countries, incomes are divided much more evenly. The super rich have a bit less than they do in the UK, but everyone else has a little more. If the total income of everyone in the UK was shared between the richest 1% and everyone else in the same way as it is in the Netherlands or Denmark, for example, 99% of us would be better off by nearly £3,000 a year per household. So, if we want to tackle poverty, we have to do something about inequality. Because higher incomes for some means lower incomes for others. Most people don't get their fair share because some are taking far more than their fair share. This is why it is essential for Britain to cut the growing pay gap between those at the very top and the rest of us. Learn more at higherpaycentre.org and inequalitybriefing.org.
So that makes the observation that a lot of people that are in poverty are also in work. Well, let's start looking at the definition of work today. First of all, we have more people on minimum wage in this country than at any time since records began. Minimum wage is £6.50 an hour, soon to be raised to a massive £6.70 an hour. It's considered that a living wage in this country is £10.50 an hour. Yet the average wage in this country is just £12 an hour. So the average wage is only a little over 10% more than the living wage. But even the ones that we've got on minimum wage, that doesn't tell the whole story, because we've got 8% of the workforce in the UK on 0 hours contracts. 0 hours contracts is slavery. Period. It's slavery. Because most of the companies that offer 0 hours contracts put exclusivity clauses on them. In other words, once you've got a 0 hours contract with that company, even though you're not guaranteed any work, and therefore not guaranteed any income, and certainly have no benefits, like holiday pay or sick pay or a pension accrual, but they put an exclusivity clause in there saying that we've offered you this 0 hours contract. If you accept it, you're not allowed to go get one with anyone else. Well, my eldest daughter, who's currently finishing the final year of her midwifery degree at Royal Berks, she's been overseas for a number of years working as a diving instructor. And when she came back to this country, she made the application to start the midwifery course, but she had a year to fill. And so she didn't want to get into something that was going to be a career. So she was only able to really find a 0 hours contract. Well, even though the 0 hours contract had an exclusivity clause, she thought, well, I can't survive on one, I'll get 3. So she got 3 0 hours contracts. And it worked fine for the first 3 months. Because the day never came in those first 3 months where more than one of the employers wanted her at the same time. And then the fateful day came when they all wanted her on the same day, and she got fired from 2 of them on the same day. And, I mean, it's just an absurdity. Now, that's okay for my daughter, because she was living with her mother at the time, so, no big deal. But if you're a main earner or a single parent, then having a 0 hours contract makes it extremely difficult to get benefits. It's difficult to get benefits in this country anyway, as we'll come on to in a second. So, what we're doing is we're forcing more and more people into poverty. Or crime. But, then we go at the benefits, and of course Atos have now lost the contract, and it's now Maximus, but it's basically the same people. And you know that Atos isn't the full title, don't you? Yeah, it's Don't Give. And the front of house benefits counsellors were instructed, they were taken on training courses as to how to sanction people's benefits, even though they knew damn well there was no reason to sanction the benefits. Because Atos was rewarded based on how little it was handing over in benefits. So they were coming up with all sorts of crap, like, you're 30 seconds late for your appointment, you're sanctioned. This in some cases is the only income that some single parents have. Now, the one case I'm going to share with you was a single mother, 2 teenage children, and she was sanctioned. And sanctioned, and sanctioned, and it went on. And, she was really struggling. And then, through the door, came a summons accusing her of benefits fraud. So she goes to the benefits office and says, how's this work? You've been sanctioning me for the last 6 months, and now I've got a court summons because I'm accused of benefits fraud. And they said, oh, yeah. Well, we can't understand how you're surviving, because you're not getting any benefits. So you must be doing something to be generating an income from somewhere else and not declaring it, because otherwise you'd be dead. And she said, I don't believe what I'm hearing. And they said, well, you'll have to take it up with the judge. So anyway, come the due date to go to court, the judge does the right thing. And the judge throws it out because there's no evidence whatsoever. Not a shred of evidence. It's total conjecture. No evidence whatsoever. So the judge not only throws it out, but actually decrees that all of the sanctioned benefits should now be paid in full. To which Atos go, good luck to that. We ain't going to pay it. What they do is they just make it extremely difficult for you to get your back benefits, so you end up basically giving up, because it takes so much time and effort to try and take on the system. Now, say?
I got mine.
Well, good on you.
I was 300 quid with it anyway.
Well, good on you for that. But it gets worse. It gets worse.
Well, I had to leave the widow because I was on ESA, and they kept trying to sanction me, but I had an advocate because I got a head injury, and they just kept stopping the sanction going through. So they started then to bill me for council tax that I wasn't eligible to pay, which started a legal battle. But then they started deducting the council tax directly out of my benefits. So they were getting the money anyway, but they were saying I was paying council tax that I wasn't eligible to pay. And that's still going on now. And I had to move to Yorkshire basically to get out of the grip of them. So they're just on my case.
Well, so these type of incidents are going on right across the country. And by the way, it gets worse, because when this girl went after the court case, I went to the benefits office, and she said, I'm due all my back benefits. And I said, well, you're going to have to make phone calls to all these various places, because I can't authorise that. Anyway, then she said, well, so what the hell am I going to do? I need some money. And the benefits guy said, have you ever thought of prostitution?
Escort, that's what they start.
And she went, what?
Escort.
Yeah.
They don't call it
Yeah.
They don't call it prostitution.
They did to Lynn's daughter as well.
Have you thought about escort?
Yeah, they did to Lynn's daughter.
You know Aegis, the people who are trying to get you back into work. That's what
the job centre tell them you're crook.
Yeah, escort, they call it.
And by the way, go and check how many young girls have gone into escorting since austerity measures came in.
Well, the thing is, you see, that escorting is not illegal, because I think the law is that basically if it's a single person operating out of a premise, then it's not illegal.
You can't point somebody towards that direction.
They did, honest to God.
So there you go, that's 2 independent sources.
That was in the job centre.
Can I just tell you
job
a
centre.
story I know? Show you how heartless they are. This is a friend of a friend further down the country in Northamptonshire. He had an intestinal problem, and so he lost a lot of weight. His weight was down to 6 stone. This is a man. He was interviewed at the job centre. He was carried in and sat in a chair, and they deemed him fit for work. That was on a Thursday. And then the following Tuesday, he died. And yet they deemed him fit for work.
Yeah.
They're like predators, though. They only go after the weak. If you can,
Like
because you're a parasite.
You can articulate yourself and stuff, and like stand up for yourself. They're like, the shy away from it.
But anybody that's not on the corporate payroll is a parasite to. That's what they're taught. You know, it's the Katie Hopkins philosophy.
Everybody who's on benefits is a scumbag.
Exactly.
They've done something wrong. They must be a criminal.
And I mean, she lives in the south of the country. Actually, she lives down in Devon.
Yeah.
But you know, she has no concept of what life is like north of Watford Gap. You know, and when you get into, well, as you well know, in the northeast and parts of the northwest, parts of South Wales, you know, there's people in these situations through no fault of their own. No fault of their own. Now, let me tell you, I have never claimed any state benefits, and I never will, because I will never give the bastards the opportunity to claim that they're supporting me when I'm trying to bring them down. You know? But I absolutely recognise the need for a benefit system. Do you know what the average benefit fraud in this country is? 55 quid. It's 55 quid. Do you know what the average banking fraud is in this country?
And that's before you even get an how much the royal family are getting paid out of our payers, please. They're the biggest benefit sheets.
Exactly. But you know why? So why is all this happening? Why everything we're talking about here? Why is it all happening? Because we are letting it happen. We are allowing it to happen. That's the collective we. We're allowing it to happen. So the question that I asked before, who's thinking of not voting? Right, it's about half of you. And it's been between a third and a half of every event that I've done so far. I'm just going to make the observation for you. I mean, ultimately it's your call, of course. I'm just going to make the observation for you. If you don't vote, you are doing exactly what the establishment wants you to do. Exactly. And now let me explain that. The establishment knows very, very well that those people who are less likely to vote are probably those that are capable of independent critical thought and don't just swallow everything that they read in the Sun and the Mail and take it as gospel truth. The establishment knows that those people who are capable of independent critical thought are less likely to vote for the mainstream parties. They are more likely to vote for an independent or a fringe party. In 2010, if everybody in this country who didn't vote, which is 10.4 million people, if everybody in this country who didn't vote had voted all for the same party, that party, whoever it might have been, would have formed the government. The Tories got 10.1 million votes. So 10.4 million would have formed a government.
But the people who don't want to vote don't want this kind of government anymore. They don't want.
They don't care. Look, the establishment doesn't care. The government doesn't care why you don't vote. It just doesn't want you to vote. Because if you're not going to vote for the establishment parties, it would rather you didn't vote. So my observation is...
I've got to differ on that one, because Tom, we held a registered to vote for the last 3 years. I get letters every month. I get people coming to the door, which I don't refuse entry, obviously. They get
Yeah, but they want you on the electoral roll because they can sell that information. Your name on the electoral roll is a very valuable asset. I mean, again, they don't care whether you don't vote, but your name being on the electoral roll is an extremely valuable asset. This is, again, the use of metadata. And, it's a value.
Well, I know that, that's why I won't register to vote.
So then
but that's your choice.
Isn't what you just said then another reason not to register to vote? Because then you're not giving them that asset to use as well if you don't register to vote.
Well, we're in a bit of a quandary, aren't we?
Yeah.
Okay? Because the bottom line is, we ain't going to change anything by not participating.
I understand.
Right? So, no, that's the reality. We're not going to change anything by not participating. So all we can do if we don't participate is bitch and whinge.
Yeah, no, fair enough. That's
what about spoiling your ballots? What about going there?
They care. They don't care. They don't care. They don't care why you don't vote. They don't care why you don't put your cross in another party, as long as you don't. So in other words, what they're trying to ensure is that the mainstream establishment parties are not going to have any serious opposition. That's why they are demonising, and that's why they demonised the Green Party for 30 years. right? And so, consequently, most people will say, no, I'll never vote Green. And you ask them, why wouldn't they vote Green? Right? Because they can't answer you. Yet, I'm just going to make the observation. First of all, there's two things here. And I know all about the Green association with Agenda 21, right? That's not something to just dismiss. But let's have a look in the short term. The Green Party manifesto. It's the only party manifesto that has an outright ban on the exploitation of unconventional gas. Right? Which means at least they're trying to protect our water supply, if nothing else. The Green Party is the first party to have ever included in any manifesto monetary reform.
Which could be the Bradbury Pound.
Which could be the Bradbury Pound. Actually, they're not proposing the Bradbury Pound, but it doesn't matter. You know, it's a step in the right direction. Now, the reality is the Green Party are not going to form a government. The Green Party are going to probably do very well if they get 3 or 4 MPs. But it's quite feasible that the Green Party is definitely going to get more votes than it's ever had before because it's got more candidates up, and because of the unconventional gas agenda, people who would never normally vote Green are now voting Green or intending to vote Green purely on the basis that it's the only party that doesn't want to exploit unconventional hydrocarbons. The monetary reform issue, I don't understand why the Green Party are not making more of it. Because, say, they're the only party ever to have done it. Now, in the short term, it's not going to make too much difference, other than to send a message to the establishment that some 14, 15, 16 or 17% of people, whatever it is, are starting to actually think about voting for a non-establishment party, because the Green are a non-establishment party. Now, in the longer term, that's still not the solution. So let's just have a look at what's going on in the short term.
But just for disruption purposes, in the short term.
Vote Green, or consider voting Green, or an independent. Right? In other words, take the votes away. Not just a no vote, not just a didn't vote.
Okay, I understand.
Let's
Have you lobbied Nigel Farage about his stance?
Absolutely. And the worst guy is the energy spokesman for UKIP, whose name will come to me in a second. He's the MEP down in... his name comes to me when I'm not thinking about it, but he's the MEP down in the East Midlands area.
I've got to go now.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Right, no, take care.
Thanks a lot, thanks for coming.
But the only thing that was making me think about not voting was all, like, or not all, but a lot of the alternative media that are following the election at the moment, especially like UK columnists saying, no matter what's going to happen, it's going to be another coalition. And this time it's going to be a rainbow coalition because the vote's going to be that sort of spread out. So that makes me sort of feel like there's no, I've got no faith in this particular election because I feel like it's sort of going to be fixed, for want of a better expression.
Oh, listen, it may well be fixed.
Make it the rainbow coalition.
It may well be fixed, and you know, I've had a lot of discussion with Brian and Mike, and you know, they're not always right.
No, they're not. But other people are saying there's going to be a rainbow coalition.
Well, look, it's either going to be Tory UKIP, or it's going to be Labour SNP. That's the reality. I mean, the Greens are not going to have enough members, I doubt.
Yeah.
I'd love to be proven wrong, but I don't think they're going to have enough members to really make a difference. So it's Tory UKIP or it's Labour SNP. And the reality is, you know what? It doesn't matter. It's going to be exactly the same agenda.
You're still getting the same control.
Absolutely. And you know, both, it doesn't matter who gets in. We're going to see exactly the same stuff. The NHS is going to be sold off.
No looking at child abuse.
But it's just to get your message across. The reason that you're saying everyone should vote is because when they count the votes and they see that they're all for like obscure things.
Absolutely.
It's to voice that you're not happy with the system.
Absolutely. And they know that you're starting. You see, they know.
We're thinking strategic.
They know that the people who don't vote either don't want to subscribe to the system or don't care.
They've just lost faith in it all.
Yeah. And they don't care. But they don't care about that. They really don't care why you vote.
In all his campaigning, not one word about child abuse.
No.
Not one word.
I know, absolutely.
And it's the biggest issue of our
Of course, and of course the whole idea is to keep the focus away from Parliament.
would be the first party that would be like pointing the finger back at their own party, because there'd be someone in their own party that would be the kiddie filler. So no one's prepared to take the first step. That's really, yeah.
Okay, look at this. They certainly manipulate. There's no question about that. And this is them telling us they manipulate, because they always love to sort of stick it in your face. This is Blair's constituency in 2005. Now, this was the height at which Blair was unpopular in the UK, because it was becoming very apparent that the country had gone to war in Iraq on the false premise of weapons of mass destruction. They knew that there was a great risk that Blair wasn't going to get re-elected in Sedgefield, which is unthinkable. A sitting Prime Minister not getting re-elected in his own constituency. So they did two things to make sure that he was going to get re-elected. Number one was they stuffed the ballot paper with a whole bunch of candidates, so that what that does is it divides all of the opposition. If you've got two candidates, if you only had two candidates, Blair would have lost. So what you do is you stuff the ballot paper with a whole bunch of other candidates, split the opposition vote, and Blair ended up with an even bigger majority in 2005 than he had in the previous election. But that wasn't just the only way they did it. Something else happened in late 2004, early 2005. Postal votes were introduced. Postal votes. Now, David Cameron gave us a clue that postal votes are going to be used to manipulate in this election as well, when he said 7 million postal votes will be cast before the election. 7 million? I don't think so. How many people do you know who are going to vote by post? I've come across one so far in all these talks. 7 million people? 1 in 7 voters voting by post? No. That's how they manipulate the outcome of a ballot. They have the postal votes ready to trot out in the event that their chosen candidate.
I don't understand, what would you need to make a postal vote for? Because I'm really ignorant on this.
If you're planning on being in business, on business in another constituency,
so you
can't get to your own constituency, or you're going to be away on vacation, then you can apply for a postal vote.
And in times of austerity, 7 million of us on holiday? No.
It ain't gonna happen. But so we know they manipulate, but let's not make it easy for them. Let's make them actually work for it. So the bottom line is that politics in this country relies on our non-participation. Basically, they want your X in the box of the establishment parties, or not at all. And once you've put your X in the box, they want you to disappear and leave them alone and never bother them. And they don't care about all the sort of letters that they get, because they have their staff to deal with that. The likelihood of a politician actually dealing personally with any of the letters that come through to them is almost slim to none. The only time they'll get involved is if there's an issue that's so significant that there's a chunk of the population that might give them a hard time over it. The rest of the time, they want to be left alone, to be getting on with whatever pet project they have, and dealing with whatever corporation is effectively bunging them the money to lobby on their behalf. The 65 MPs that are not standing for re-election in May, most of them are going straight onto a corporate payroll as the reward for the lobbying that they were doing on behalf of those companies whilst they were sitting as an MP. William Hague is one of the MPs not standing again, and it is estimated that he's going to earn 20 million in his first year out of Parliament, primarily for the arms industry, because he's been banging the drum of war for Syria, of course, for the last few years. So his reward will be to pick up a few consultancy contracts, high-dollar consultancy contracts on behalf of the arms industry. In the US, the average member of the House of Representatives, 7.1 million. The average net worth of a member of the Senate, just over 10 million. It's all about this. Now, there's a few things starting to change. The anti-fracking community across the country 2 years ago was 4 groups. 3 on the Fylde Peninsula in the Blackpool area and 1 in Sussex. Today there's over 300 groups. There's no national organisation. there's no leaders. There's no chairman, treasurer, secretary, no project leader for this, project leader for that. There's 300 totally autonomous groups around the country, all operating in different ways.
Just care about where they live.
Then they care about where they live. And I don't care, I'm being a bit facetious here, but I don't really care whether what motivates them is the fact that they don't want the water poisoned, or whether they're concerned about the fall in their property price. You know, whatever pushes their buttons, but they come on board. And you know what? One of the key learning experiences from these people coming into this group is to learn to focus on what we agree on and stop getting bogged down on what we disagree on. Because the anti-fracking community is actually a community that represents people from right across the political spectrum, right across the social spectrum, the philosophical and the religious spectrum. So actually, when you come down to it, there's probably not much that the people who would consider themselves as part of the anti-fracking community agree on, other than the fact they don't agree with unconventional gas exploitation. And we can always tell when there's an attempt to try and break a group because somebody goes in there and starts to try and cause division. Oh, he's a climate change denier, don't you know?
But they're also very representative of society, those groups.
Of course they are, right across society. But the challenge is as soon as anybody starts to try to create division, is to be big enough to just not engage, you know, to sort of push aside and say, hang on a second, you know, yeah, it's actually healthy that we have different views on things. We don't all have to agree on everything.
But as you've shown, these gas fields do not discriminate.
Exactly.
Whether you live in a mansion or a
Exactly right.
It's the same.
Exactly. And now we've got other groups that are starting to model themselves, without actually ever discussing it, of course, because there's no structure. But have you heard of Beat the Bailiffs?
Yeah.
A Response?
Yeah.
You know, these are groups that are springing up in the same way. They are local community groups of like-minded people who are realising that there's massive social injustice. You know, with people who are terminally ill being told that they're fit for work, or being evicted from their social housing because they can't pay the rent because they had the bedroom tax impacted upon them. You know, with people who are seriously disabled being evicted. You know, the local community are coming together and saying, you know what, this is wrong. It's wrong and we're not going to let it happen. So politicians, local politicians, county politicians, district politicians and MPs are now starting to be lobbied more than they've ever known before.
Which is why they're not appearing as much.
Exactly, it's why they're hiding. Why they're hiding. I mean, I was at the planning meeting of North York Moors Planning Committee. This is where Third Energy wanted to drill a re-injection well on Emerson Moor. Everyone of the planning committee made the statement that they had received more correspondence, more phone calls, more emails on this subject than ever before.
Wow.
The BBC cameras were in the room. I was filming it. Every member of that committee knew, because the place was packed, there were people who couldn't get in, they were standing outside. Every member of that committee knew they were being scrutinised like never before. Now we've got 3 cases going on at the moment around the country where MPs, because they're not used to this, they are claiming that they're being harassed or stalked. No, it's scrutiny. And if you stand for public office, then you have to be prepared to open yourself to scrutiny. And that means that any decision that you make is subject to scrutiny. And that's why they did this vote after the budget, in the hope that nobody would really take any notice. Because those MPs don't want to be scrutinised on why they were voting to remove all participation of local authorities in the decision-making process of where toxic nuclear waste is going to be dumped.
And the other factor, of course, that vote, the figures you gave, roughly 250, 270 people took part in the vote.
It's less than half.
Out of a total of 600 odd?
630 odd, yeah, it's absolutely. The rest of them all buggered off, or in the
But they're
bar,
also-
couldn't be asked.
But they're also making rules for the whole of the country that only apply to some regions.
Yes.
And that's not right either.
Exactly. Well, it's going to get worse when the SNP are part of the coalition. But you see, this is, come back to the point. The reason that we're in this mess is because we, the collective we, have allowed it to happen. We have we have been encouraged to not engage, and we've said, okay, well, fine, we're not engaged now. Now, this has to change, and it is changing. It is changing. And it doesn't matter what it is that we get involved in, because there's so many issues, but you know, there are issues that people need to pick up on locally. And get engaged, and it doesn't matter what it is, but get engaged with something, because what we need to start doing, holding our politicians, whether we vote for them or not, after May the 7th, they're our MP. And they need to know that we are going to be on their case. We, the collective we, is, that we're going to be on their case. And they are going to be scrutinised. Whomever gets into office on May the 7th is going to be scrutinised in this term of Parliament like they've never ever seen before. You know, we've got to break down this three-line whip so that when an MP is made aware that the views of their constituents that elected them are X, they don't vote Y just because they've been told to do so by the three-line whip. And if they do, then, you know, even join the party, you know, join the local party so that you have a voice there. Because most of the local parties only have a very, very few members. So we've got to start playing the game. Now, you know, this may sound perverse, because this isn't the only thing we need to be doing, but basically we've got to